American warplanes and drones hit more ISIS targets. The strikes were part of what is being described as a near-continuous assault on militant targets in Iraq and Syria. They targeted ISIS tanks, checkpoints, and bunkers. The strikes appear to be forcing militants to change tactics and move in smaller groups.
Cutting off the funding that fuels this hate. It's time to end the hypocrisy of those who accumulate wealth through the global economy and then siphon funds to those who teach children to tear it down.
At the UN this week, President Obama and Stephen Harper both highlighted the importance of stopping the flow of funds to extremist groups like ISIS. The militant group is said to be one of the wealthiest terrorist organizations. Some estimates say they are backed by more than $2 billion, much of it coming from overseas. There are concerns businesses and banks in Canada are being used to help fund groups like ISIS. Christine Duhaime is a lawyer and financial crime specialist. She says the Canadian government is not doing enough to stop terrorist financing. Christine, nice to have you here in studio. So we just heard from President Barack Obama, probably echoing what you think. But it's one thing to hear the U.S. president saying, we need to stop these funds from going to ISIS fighters. But you feel as though, especially in this country, Canada needs to hit the panic button. Canada is not doing enough to stop the flow of these funds going there, right?
Yeah. I think one of the issues we face in Canada is we seem to have more homegrown terrorists here than in Australia or the U.S. Just looking at the numbers, we had, according to a CSIS, 130 Canadians that left to go fight in terrorist hotspots, compared to Australia, which was 60 with an equivalent population, and the U.S. with 10 times the population had 100. So if you just look at the numbers of some of those people are coming back to Canada and intend to act as lone wolves or more radicalized, then I think just numerically we have a problem in Canada in terms of potential acts of terrorism. But we also have some issues where some of our funds are being sent to conduit countries like Lebanon, and perhaps Jordan is another one that comes up often. And so financial transactions are being routed through those countries, but not directly to Syria, so they're difficult to catch.
So how are they doing that? How are they actually directing those funds? I mean, where's it going? What institutions are they going through?
Well, some of it is banking. Australia released a study last week that talked about the banks are still the biggest source of funding for terrorism, unwittingly. And so what they do is they will send funds through MSBs or through banks. Those
What's
are the
MSB?
two. Money service business, I'm sorry. Yeah, or through a bank. And they will wire it overseas to, as I said, a conduit country. And then that money will either be carried over personally or sent from hawalas, which are people that do money transfer businesses in person in those types of countries, and they will bring the money over that way. So they use conduit countries to get it there, but they still use our banks as the primary source of getting the funds overseas.
All right. So as you say, the banks here are probably doing this unwittingly.
Yes. Yeah.
So how does a government come in and try and stop that from happening?
I think one of the things that they do is they have more of a dialogue and they educate the financial services industry about how this is happening, and that's one of the things I think is not happening in Canada but is happening in Australia. For example, I had a client that had someone who was in Lebanon using a debit card, and this was a bank, and yet the customer who owned the debit card was in the bank in Alberta, but his debit card's being used in Lebanon every day for as much as it can be used. So you have to, that's a red flag for the bank. And so I think if banks have an idea of how terrorist financing works and they use the conduit countries, then they will be more alert to terrorist financing and take steps to stop it.
Were you surprised to hear that $2 billion estimate that ISIS has $2 billion?
No, not really. And I think it's because in the Middle East, they don't have the strong anti-money laundering controls that we have here. So they don't stop transactions as forcefully and as diligently as we do here.
And Bitcoin, you also raised that as a big concern. Tell us about why you're concerned about Bitcoins being used.
Bitcoin is a fantastic technology and it's sort of the wave of the future, but it has some concerns at the moment because it allows for the transfer of value, but without it being monitored in terms of anti-money laundering or counter-terrorist risks. So you can send
cash.
Right, so you can send, it's a value, it's like a Starbucks card with, although it's not a card, but you can send money, or you buy a Bitcoin on the computer and you can send that value wherever you want for someone in another country to cash it out. So that has no controls. So if I was a terrorist, I'd be looking to Bitcoin as a great way to send money. But the U.S. government has said that it has no evidence that Bitcoin's ever been used for this purpose. But the potential is there. It's a risk that needs to be, I think, addressed.
What do you do to try and stop that?
The Canadian government has proposed legislation to monitor Bitcoin transactions so that when you buy it or when you sell it out of the system, it will be monitored and tracked. But some of it is the technology really can't fit into that regime. So I think we need to find a way to make sure that something like Bitcoin or digital finance can work with our anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist legislation.
All right, so the Canadian government, they update their list on terrorist entities to include ISIS by name. The criminal code includes penalties for individuals and organizations that are part of groups like ISIS that finance these listed groups of terrorist organizations. Does that help, or is there more that needs to be done to make sure that these loopholes, these conduits, are just stopped?
I think on the international level, when we look to places like Turkey, a lot of the money that ISIS is getting now is from illegal oil sales. But they have to bank that money somewhere, and they're banking it in places like Turkey and in Lebanon. So I think the bigger picture is, what are those countries doing, and what can we do to get them on board to stop terrorist financing on the huge volumes of dollars? On the smaller amounts coming out of the United States, Canada, Australia, for example, I think we need to educate the banks on how terrorist financing actually works, as Australia is doing a good job with at the moment. I think Canada needs to get more on board on educating the financial institutions and coming up with studies on how this works so that they can stop it at our level.
So it's interesting, because Canada seems to be, ratcheting up the rhetoric that we're in this. The Australians are in it too. So if the Australians are on board with all of this, have you had talks with anyone in the Canadian government, any bureaucrats, to try and say, look, you people need to do something more, follow the Australians to try and stop this financing from going to terrorist groups like ISIS?
I haven't had discussions with them, no, but I think that dialogue needs to occur, and I think it also needs to occur with the private enterprise, because they are the people that own the infrastructure that is going to be attacked if there's an attack in Canada. So it's their assets we're talking about. It's their insurances that that is going to go up. It's all this huge infrastructure, the bridges, the pipelines. That if there's going to be an attack in Canada, it'll be on those types of assets. So I think we need to have private enterprise in the dialogue as well to make sure we're protecting those.
Let me ask you, for banks to say, oh well, we unwittingly became this conduit to this as a lawyer. Can a bank just say that? Oh, we didn't know where this money was going? Or are you culpable by association, if you will?
I think until last Monday, they have been saying all along, look, we're only responsible for looking after the listed entities and stopping listed money. But there was a case in the U.S. on Monday, our bank case, where a bank was found liable, potentially in the hundreds of billions of dollars now. We don't know the amount because the jury award triple damages. And it was found liable for, in fact, terrorist financing. And what it did is it allowed a charity in the Middle East to bank with it. In New York City, it's the Arab Bank, but it's New York branch. Also had branches in the Middle East. And so in a typical normal wiring of funds and banking services, it's been found liable for terrorist financing. And there are 100 more cases in the pipeline like that in the U.S., including Bank of China, including foreign banks in the U.S., of which there are many Canadian foreign banks.
Right.
So I think compliance people and directors and officers now of banks need to sit down and say, okay, look, if we're going to be on the hook for terrorist financing, we can't just rely on our lists. We need to look at the more global picture, which is, I think, where we come to the point where we need to be doing more to educating financial institutions on who are terrorists and how do they get money overseas. And I think it helps the banks in terms of mitigating their liability. It's good for everyone, and it protects us.
Well, that's right. And money talks, right? So the banks will probably start paying more attention if they know that they're going to be on the hook for
billions of dollars.
Billions of dollars.
And Canada has similar legislation. So other foreign banks operating in Canada, because we adopted this American regime of this liability for terrorist injuries, are potentially on the hook. So I think there should be a dialogue about how do we either, take some steps to not bankrupt the banks on this terrorist financing issue and find ways that we're all comfortable with, that we can stop the flow of money and control our financial regime.
Really good to talk to you about this. Really interesting, Christine. Thank you very much.
Yes, you're welcome.